All right, everyone, welcome back. This is going to be the final lecture for Unit 2. So we're going to be talking about economies and power balances and things of this sort. This is going to be by from the piece from Bernabo and Schmid, and then I'm going to add some stuff. I thought this was a great piece. I was a little frustrated with a couple of things. One was like the editing. There were some misspelled words, some grammar issues, which bothers me. It's supposed to be, highly professional technical paper, but I really did like the different lenses through which they looked at power on the regional level as sort of a regional hegemon, at the international level, from an investment perspective, from an energy perspective. This is a pretty well built and easy to grasp paper. So I really liked this one. All right, so we'll start at slide one. Economics as hard power, right? So, how is economics hard power? And it's mostly through influence, right? Influence not only in purchasing power, like trade, sanctions, and those sorts of things, which can really cripple a country's sort of middle class, gives you more leverage in negotiations, but it also gives you more power in rules bodies and international institutions and these sorts of things. The bigger your economy, the more powerful you're going to be in bilateral trade negotiations as well. So, economics is powerful in a lot of ways. Oh, and of course, like military spending, military research and development, all of these things. Economics and trade specifically are very powerful, and they are one leg of Immanuel Kant's triangle of peace, right? So, in international relations, we talk a lot about Immanuel Kant, who is sort of the father of liberal strand of international relations philosophy. And his idea, and this goes back hundreds of years, right? But his idea was that if countries have three things in common, they're very, very unlikely to go to war. And these three things are bilateral trade, some sort of international law and agreement, and democracy, or what they called republicanism at the time. And it's because citizens don't like war, right? Like leaders are okay with like waiting it out and people dying, but citizens don't like that, right? And so when democracy is part of the triangle, it strengthens as well. And not only was this sort of theoretically built, I think it's around the 18th century by Immanuel Kant in the Germany Austria region, but it's also gotten incredible statistical and observational support from science over the last hundreds of years. And we do find that the democratic triangle of peace works, right? Now, the caveat I want to add here is this only works for two democracies who have bilateral trade and international agreements, etc. Autocracies are likely to fight each other, and democracies are just as likely to fight autocracies, right? And so this only works when you have all three pieces in place. And so democracies aren't necessarily less warlike, they're just less warlike with each other. Okay, a focus on the Middle East, if we're talking about economics as hard power, of course, we have to consider the sort of oil reserves and the rentier state system, right? These are not democracies. They do not have to sort of keep their citizens happy. And we see a lot of conflict roiling around the area, arguably because they're not democracies, right? They also tend to have poor economic management and high levels of debt. So even Saudi Arabia, who everyone thinks would be doing very well, is trying to quietly do a currency swap with the United States Treasury. And people, insiders are kind of throwing a fit. Like, there's no reason for this. This is just going to put, more risk on the U.S. asset holdings. And so this is kind of a weird phenomenon. We also saw the same thing happen with Javier Milei in Argentina a few months ago, where Trump basically propped up his economy right before an election by shifting $20 billion by purchasing Argentinian reals, right? And Saudi Arabia is at the moment trying to do this same thing, which is very odd. Finally, the Mideast, the state is the main actor, right? And so while realism in international relations sort of already assumes that the state is the main actor, liberalism and constructivism and others don't really make that assumption, right? But you're sort of forced to make that assumption because of the setup of the governments. There are no real NGOs, there are no real civil society organizations. The economic leaders are generally very leaned on by the state or are members of the state, right? And so we have to really think of the state as the main actor. And finally, there's a big competition in the region for regional hegemony. Hegemony is the idea that you're sort of the overarching state and no one can question your authority. So, like at the global scene, maybe it was Greece and Rome and the U.S. post Cold War, these sorts of things, right? But there are also arguments about sort of regional hegemonies, and so a lot of these states want to be the regional hegemon, and external actors like Europe, China, the U.S. have major concerns about who that hegemon ends up being, and sometimes will undermine or support depending on their own sort of ideological perspective. And so some of the states that really want to compete for hegemony in the region, of course, are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are in sort of competition against each other. And then you add Iran, who is at loggerheads against basically everyone in the region. Israel, right, who has an entirely different sort of religious and ethnic and um, from the that is distinct from the entire region, right, which sort of marks them out as a target as well. And then I would also add Egypt. I think Egypt has always wanted to be the regional hegemon and still sees themselves in that role. Like, I think they know they're not there right now, right? But there's also 5,000 years of history of them playing that role. And so, like, I do think that they want to scrape and claw their way up into that position eventually once again. Okay, the next slide. Here's a really nice little layout of just realism, liberalism, and idealism, or sort of what we call constructivism in political science. Realism is what we'll focus on today, and this is sort of your final project for the semester. And a lot of this starts with Morgenthau in 1948, after World War II, and how we, as the US and NATO especially, were going to approach the communists and sort of the world, right? And so, this strain of literature is ongoing today. I think we're moving back into sort of an age of realism again. And so it kind of shifts over time. Starts with Morgenthau in 48, moves to Mearsheimer and Waltz in the 50s, who sort of talk about neo-realism and these sorts of things. Aaron joins in the 1960s, and he talks about, okay, yes, we do have these indicators of power, but we're missing this relational piece, right? Like, okay, we have a whole bunch of nuclear weapons, but like, how does that relate to someone else's stockpile or whatever that might be, right? I don't know why it took 20 years to get there, or 15, but yeah, of course, like power is relational. Okay, so what is the theory? At its core, there are three basic, very simple assumptions, right? Number one, we live in what's called an anarchic system. And this means that there's no legitimate or enforcing supranational governing body, right? The UN exists and these sort of organizations exist. But as we see, when things break down, the blue hats don't really do much of anything other than try and like ease the tensions, baby, right? Like get people out of the area, provide food. Um, but it's been pretty few and far between where the UN actually holds someone to account. And usually, those that they hold to account are either in the Middle East or in Africa, right? They usually don't hold, South American genocidists or Western genocidists, let's be real, to account, unless it was either the Nazis post World War II or, African warlords and these sorts of things. But what anarchy does not mean is chaos, right? This is not anarchy in our sort of common parlance. This is just the idea that every state has to fend for itself in because there is no overarching governing body. Okay, the second assumption is that states are the main actors. They mostly ignore NGOs, economic leaders, other political leaders, etc. Right? They sort of conceptualize power and existence as simply a territorial boundary, right? A state. And their final assumption, for the most part, right, at least originally, is that we're playing a zero sum game, right? Every gain for me is a loss for you, and every gain for Saudi Arabia is a loss for the United States, right? This is very distinct from liberalism, which says that trades can, trade and international organizations and these sorts of things sort of, you know, what is this saying? A rising tide lifts all boats, right? That's the liberal perspective. The realist perspective is hell no. Every gain that you get is a knock on me, right? And so we need to be very aware of who is gaining in this world. All right, next slide. Morgenthau's measures of state power. So this is basically your final project. There are 8 measures that Morgenthau introduced to try and operationalize or define what power is, right? What hard power is. And we'll talk about soft power in a little while. Sometimes it can kind of like weave into each other, but for the most part, hard power is military economic, soft power is like cultural. All right. Number one measure, military preparedness. And I would list probably Turkey, which has a pretty high standard military and has a military history. Iran, for a few reasons, which we'll talk about toward the end, also has a very powerful military. Israel, of course, not only because of their sort of booming economy, but also they're maybe the world's best surveillance state. They have high tech equipment, they have high training, and they're constantly being put to the test, which kind of keeps them sharp. They also get support from the West that a lot of these other states would not would not receive, as we are seeing, right? Okay, and then finally, I would add Saudi Arabia. Here's the question, though, about Saudi Arabia: is all right, you got all the shiny toys like F-15 jet fighters and some of the world's best artillery equipment, and some new and top line missiles and things like this. How well trained is your military, though, right? How dedicated and loyal is your military? Just having a bunch of shiny toys is not all that useful, as we saw in 1967 with the Egyptians when they got routed despite having a lot of Soviet equipment, right? Um, and so Saudi Arabia, I wanted to list because they are rising quickly militarily, but a lot of that is technology, right? And technology bought from the United States sort of to kind of look away on their other stuff, right? And to get access to oil and these sorts of things, right? But there are big questions about how capable they would actually be if it came down to a military confrontation, right? Like they weren't all that capable in Yemen. And as the United States versus Iran is showing right now, technology doesn't necessarily win wars, right? Yeah, we got a whole bunch of shiny toys, but that's not really how wars are even fought anymore. Um, and so, yeah, we'll talk about some of that stuff toward the end too. All right. What is the second measure of state power? According to Morgenthau, it is geography. Now, this one's going to be hard, right? Because I'm kind of telling you you're going to have to come up with all your own new measures, and I sat and I've tried to sort of just brainstorm about how I might approach this. And there's a lot of different ways, right? You could use total land mass like they did, but I think that's misleading, especially given the area and all the desert that exists, right? Like much of that is not really even usable land. You couldn't even really station troops there because there's no water, these sorts of things. I thought about maybe agricultural land, right, which would probably empower places like Iraq because of their rivers, Egypt because of their rivers, but they don't seem the strongest. Developed land, right? Like, well, are there agricultural or commercial properties, industrial properties, these sorts of things? Maybe ports or sea access, right? We know that makes you very powerful in the region if you have access to the ocean. This is also just an overarching power in the world, right? If you're landlocked, you're pretty fucked in the world because you can't really export goods. It's really hard to build your economy, these sorts of things, right? So if you have access to the sea, and then even better, you have access to like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz, those are very powerful strategic positions on the planet. Let's see, what was the last one? Oh, I just talked about that. Okay, the third measure of state power is natural resources, and obviously we got to focus on oil here. And then I would also say we need to be thoughtful about water access, right? Water, I think, is a natural resource. Even though it's not necessarily commodified like oil is, it is vital to survival, right? And so that kind of strain as I should say global warming, as climate change um, starts to happen, or continues to happen and gets further and further exacerbated, these water problems are going to rise because it's the most critical region on Earth for these problems, right? And we're starting to see these problems rise even in the United States, right? In Texas, Corpus Christi's having problems with water. All of these data centers are soaking up water in largely in the areas that don't have the water to give, right? The Colorado River Basin is dropping. There are arguments between Utah, Arizona, Nevada, all of these about who gets what water. I mean, this is going to be a rising crisis. All right, number four, industrial capacity. For the most part, this is largely non existent outside of the sort of petroleum realm, right? But maybe Turkey you could throw on here. They've diversified quite a bit. They do have a pretty decent export market, right? I don't know who else you might add to this list, though. Okay, next slide. This is going to be number 5 and 6 of Hans Morgenthau's measures of power. So number 5, population, right? And this one's pretty simple. The problem is the counts in the area are terrible. There's really bad data on this kind of stuff, especially in states that have poor um, functionality, right? How do you even count your population? Most of them don't work in the formal economy. This is a very difficult thing for developing states, right? And there are new papers that are coming out that are saying we may have undercounted the world population by like maybe 1 billion to 2 billion. So we might actually be closer to 11 or 12 billion people, because they're not counting rural areas and these sorts of things, right? So really fascinating stuff. They haven't really landed on, how correct this is or which counting methods we should use or whatever, but this is difficult in these places. What are some other ways we could think of population that could affect power? I was thinking immigration, right? There's a lot of labor immigration, and even some say sort of labor slavery still in the area, where people are shipped in from places like Malaysia, Bangladesh, India, etc., to work in rich Saudi and Omani and Bahraini and UAE households, or oil fields or whatever it might be, right? But there's real problems with rights, payments, these sorts of things. And then another idea about population and power is heterogeneity, right? Like how diverse is your society? That can be problematic, right? We know that the more diverse a society is, the less likely they are to dole out public goods, right? If you look different from me, I don't want you getting public goods, right? And this is not just sort of a MidEast problem, but it's an America problem and a Europe problem. And this is just sort of ingrained in human behavior, right? And so it could mean things like less infrastructure, worse education, less social safety nets, or it could mean conflict, right? Ethnic conflict, religious conflict, terrorism, sporadic terrorist events, these sorts of things, right? And that can sort of weaken your power externally because you have massive internal problems, right? So there are different ways to think about population as power. All right. Number six, what is the national character or morale of your population? Again, this is really hard to measure. They mention something in the text about quote unified discourse, right? But how the hell do you measure that? And how could you possibly know that in repressive regimes where citizens are unwilling to speak about their real opinions, right? And so this is a very difficult thing to do. And this sort of touches on my little discussion about Saudi Arabia's military and how sort of efficacious they'll actually be. Yes, they have toys, you know, are they unified inside of their military, right? There are schisms about inequality, there are frustrations about human rights, there are frustrations about speech and association, there are religious schisms in Saudi Arabia between the hardliners and the sort of centrists. So there's a lot of issues, right? And we can't really know until they're put to the test, right? Okay. They also make these claims about the area having very weak soft power. This paper was written in 2020, and so they should have been better about, in my opinion. I think they're just flat out wrong. I think that the region's soft power is growing drastically, and we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter. And they say maybe Turkey and Israel have growing soft power. I would agree; those two are sort of standouts in this topic. But the Palestinian movement has grown like gangbusters in recent years, right? Like it has become again a sort of global movement, and especially a pan-Arab movement. You're seeing rising anti-Semitism, right, as Israel takes a hard right turn, um, commits some questionable retaliation against, Gaza and their citizens, um, and now sort of attacks against Iran and Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and the very very far right coalition they've built, and there are cracks appearing in Israel's soft power for sure. And then I would say Saudi soft power and UAE too are growing like gangbusters, right? They have been very thoughtful and manipulative, I would even say, about sort of washing up their image, making themselves not look like rich royals and dictators, but rather like, I don't know, these global cool guys. MBS, right? Mohammed bin Salman's trying to make himself to be like this whole revolutionary leader and changer of Saudi society and all of this sort of stuff. But man, it feels like bullshit to me. I gotta be real. But they're using things like sports and video games and entertainment and all of this money they're throwing around in the investment world through their sort of what's called PIF, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And, it's a lot of whitewashing, and we'll talk about that at the end. All right. I'm going to do the last piece of Morgenthau, and then I'll cut it in half and I'll start a new one. Here are the last two measures of state power. You've got quality of diplomacy. This is pretty interesting, and I had to go sort of look up some data sets on diplomacy quality. There's a couple out there; they're pretty cool. And you can see here on this one that I found from Statista, China and the US lead. We would expect that, right? But Turkey is in number 3, only one from the region, right? But they are growing exponentially in sort of professionalized diplomacy, not only in their area, but with China, who's very close to them, Russia, who's very close to them, and then Europe, who is pretty close to them, right? So they have done pretty amazing things in improving their quality of governance, democracy, diplomacy, all of these things. But they're the only ones on sort of this top list. I would also add that some other states are getting better at this, right? Partly because of that whitewashing and all the money they've been throwing around. Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, and probably Qatar and Bahrain. Okay, the final score, the final measurement, according to Morgenthau, is the quality of your governance. And I would say that this is pretty piss poor across the region. Turkey is probably the only one that would stand out as sort of a solidified democracy or getting close. Maybe Jordan, right? But most of these are dictatorships. They have poor governance because they're always sort of transitioning people from their roles, like we talked about. So no one ever gains expertise. They have poor education systems, like all this kind of stuff, right? Um, yeah. So, and I would also add that a lot of these states have been far more focused on becoming more economically viable than they have in becoming internally governance viable, right? Like they don't really care about that. They care about the money. All right, like I mentioned, Aaron from 1963 adds this relational element, right? We got to compare it with others to understand what power looks like. All right, that's the end of this one. We've already hit a half hour, so I'll finish up the second half in another one. Thanks so much for being here, y'all.